She said my kids weren't safe with me. She had no legal right to touch them. Then she took them anyway. By sundown, my babies were locked in her house. I called the police. Sir. Weeks later, the truth about her past came out. She'd done this before. And she had no idea who she just crossed. My name is Marcus Ellison. I'm a father of 2, Zoe and Caleb, and for 6 years I served as a federal district judge in Atlanta. Most of my neighbors in Brookstone Estates knew me as the quiet guy in the gray Volvo who left before sunrise and came home after dark. Nothing more. My wife, Renee, died 3 years earlier, a drunk driver on I-285. I raised the kids alone since, with help from our nanny, Talia, and a schedule stitched together out of sheer stubbornness. I never wanted attention. I just wanted my children safe, fed, and loved. That was the whole plan. Brookstone Estates was the kind of neighborhood where the grass got measured with a ruler and mailboxes matched down to the screws. I bought the house because of the good schools, not the community newsletter. I didn't know yet that the newsletter was the least of what ran that place. Deborah Kilgore ran the HOA board like a small kingdom. She'd held the presidency for 11 years, and in that time she'd fined, warned, and shamed half the street into submission. People called her Deborah to her face and something else behind her back. The first time I met her, she stood at my door holding a clipboard before I'd even unpacked the moving truck. She asked, without smiling, whether I was renting or actually purchasing. I told her I'd closed on the house that morning. She wrote something down anyway. Talia noticed it before I did. That woman watches your yard like it owes her money, she said one evening, nodding toward the window. I laughed it off. A docket that didn't care about neighborhood politics. Small things started arriving in the mailbox. A notice about grass height. A notice about a trash can left out 4 hours past pickup. A notice about a basketball hoop creating visual clutter. Every other house on the block had a hoop. Only mine got flagged. I paid the fines without argument. $30 here, $50 there. It was easier than fighting a system built by people who'd been fighting each other over paint colors since before I was born. I had bigger cases waiting on my desk than a mailbox complaint. Zoe, 10 years old and fearless, waved at Deborah every morning from the bus stop. Deborah never waved back. She'd just tilt her head, the way you'd look at something you couldn't quite place, and write in the little notebook she carried everywhere. Caleb, 7, asked me once why the clipboard lady always stood at the edge of our lawn instead of walking on it. I told him some people like keeping their distance. I didn't tell him I'd started keeping distance too, on purpose, to avoid giving her reasons. At the spring HOA meeting, Deborah stood at the podium and read a list of concerns about unsupervised minors on the block. She didn't say my name. Every head in the room turned toward the back row, where I sat alone. Patricia Nguyen, 2 houses down, caught my eye and gave a small, apologetic shake of her head. She'd lived there 15 years. Later she told me, quietly, in her driveway, she does this. Picks a family. Don't let her pick you. I should have listened harder. Made dinner, helped with homework, and told myself the woman with the clipboard was a headache, not a threat. I'd spent a career reading people who lied for a living. I thought I knew what real danger looked like. I was wrong about that, in ways I wouldn't understand for months. Ron Kilgore, Deborah's husband, treated the whole thing like weather he couldn't control. He'd nod at me over the fence, say, "Hell of a season for pollen," and disappear back inside before his wife noticed him talking to the neighbor she'd already decided to dislike. I later learned Ron kept the HOA's actual financial records, separate from the polished ones Deborah presented at meetings. At the time, I only knew him as a tired man who flinched slightly whenever her voice rose from an open window. Talia started keeping a folder of the notices, dated and organized, just in case. I told her she was being paranoid. She reminded me I was a judge who spent all day proving that paranoid people were sometimes just early. I kept the folder. Deborah's concern language had a rhythm to it. Never your children. Always children in this community. Never you. Always certain households. It let her aim without ever pointing. And everyone in that meeting room knew exactly where the arrow landed. One Tuesday, she stopped me in the driveway to ask, apropos of nothing, where I actually worked. I said downtown. She asked doing what? He smiled the smile of someone filing information away for later use, and said, "How nice for you." I didn't correct the vagueness. Force of habit, judges don't advertise. But I noticed, walking back inside, that her question hadn't felt curious. It had felt like reconnaissance. Zoe came home one afternoon and said Mrs. Kilgore had asked her, sweetly, whether Daddy's home a lot and whether the babysitter stays overnight sometimes. 10 years old, and she still knew enough to feel uneasy repeating it to me. I called the school to make sure no one outside approved contacts had questioned my kids on school property. Nothing had happened there. Whatever Deborah was building, she was building it door to door, conversation by conversation. On our own street, Patricia told me Deborah kept files on 3 other families before mine, 1 Korean, 1 interracial, 1 single mother. All 3 had moved within 2 years. She doesn't run people off with shouting, Patricia said. She runs them off with paperwork and phone calls nobody can prove. I filed that away the way I filed away every witness statement that didn't fit the official story yet. Worth remembering, not yet worth acting on. That patience would almost cost me everything. The first real spark came on an ordinary Thursday. Talia had a dentist appointment and asked me to cover a 90-minute gap after school. I left the courthouse early, hit traffic on 85, and arrived 14 minutes after the bus dropped the kids off. 14 minutes. On our own front steps, backpacks beside them, doing homework in the shade. Nothing was on fire. Nothing was broken. Children are supposed to be home, safe, waiting for a parent running slightly late. Deborah was already there when I pulled in. Not near her house. 3 feet from my children. Phone raised, recording them like evidence at a crime scene. "Do you have any idea?" she said before I'd even closed my car door. "How long these children have been alone?" I told her 14 minutes, and it was my fault, and I was there now. She kept filming. "I've called this in," she said. I asked, calmly, "Called what in?" "The proper authorities," she said, chin lifted. "For the safety of these children." My stomach dropped for the first time since Renee's funeral. I asked her, still calm, still using the tone I saved for hostile witnesses. What authority she believed she had to detain, film, or report my children without a single conversation with me first. She said, "Someone has to look out for them since you clearly don't." Zoe, watching this, said quietly, "Daddy, we were fine." Caleb just stared at Deborah's phone like it was something dangerous. I told them to go inside, and for the first time, Deborah stepped slightly to block the path to my own front door. I didn't raise my voice. It happens to black men who raise their voices in rooms where someone else controls the narrative. I said, evenly, "Move, Deborah." She moved, but she kept filming until I closed the door behind my kids. That night, I called the county's Division of Family and Children Services myself, preemptively, to report the incident and ask if a complaint had actually been filed. The intake worker found nothing yet. Deborah's call-it-in had been theater for now. Talia was furious when I told her. "She filmed them," she kept repeating, like saying it twice would make it make sense. It didn't make sense. I would learn. Wasn't the last time. I drafted a calm, lawyerly email to the HOA board that night, not as a judge, just as a resident, documenting the incident and requesting the board clarify what authority, if any, individual members had regarding minors on private property. I never expected a real answer. The board's response, 3 days later, was one line: "The HOA takes all resident concerns seriously and encourages open communication." Deborah had written it. I recognized her phrasing the way you recognize a lawyer's tell after cross-examining them for 2 hours. Patricia stopped by that weekend with a casserole and a warning. "She's not going to let this go," she said. "The families before you, this is exactly how it started." A phone. A file. I asked what came after the file. Patricia didn't answer right away. "After the file," she finally said, "she finds a way to make it official. She knows someone at the county office. Nobody's ever proven anything, but nobody's ever stayed to fight her, either." I told Patricia I wasn't planning to move. I should have asked her, right then, for a name. I didn't. A man solving a neighborhood dispute. Not like a man who spent his days watching how ordinary power gets abused when nobody's checking it. Caleb started asking, at bedtime, whether the clipboard lady was going to take him away. I told him no. Absolutely not. That was not how anything worked in this country. I believed every word of it when I said it. I filed the Deborah folder, Talia's folder, now mine, with dates, screenshots, and a printed copy of the HOA's non-answer. Evidence habits die hard. I told myself it was just in case. Some part of me already knew in case was coming. Deborah, meanwhile, was busy elsewhere. Patricia mentioned she'd seen her at the county courthouse annex twice that month, chatting in the hallway with a woman from the clerk's office like old friends. At the time, it meant nothing to me. It would mean everything later. I asked around the neighborhood, carefully, whether anyone else had documentation of Deborah's history with the earlier families. 2 people gave vague answers and changed the subject fast. Fear, I recognized, has a very specific posture. I'd seen it in witness boxes for years. By the end of that week, Deborah hadn't filed an actual CPS report. But she'd started something worse and quieter. She'd started talking to the board, to the block, to anyone who'd listen, about concerns regarding the Ellison children's home environment. The narrative had begun. I didn't fight the narrative directly. I focused on the kids, on routine, on being visibly, boringly present at every bus stop for the next 2 weeks straight. It felt like building a case for a trial I didn't yet know was scheduled. Little did I know, Deborah wasn't building a narrative for the neighborhood. She was building a paper trail for something with an actual filing number. The following Monday, 3 separate neighbors mentioned, almost casually, that Deborah had asked them if they'd ever seen unusual activity at my house. Not illegal activity. Not concerning activity. Unusual. Weight and infinite room to grow. Patricia finally gave me the name I should have asked for weeks earlier. Sherry Voss, a clerk in the County Family Court's records office. And, turned out, Deborah's college roommate of nearly 30 years. They've stayed close, Patricia said. That's who helps her file things fast. I didn't yet know what things meant. I assumed complaints. Maybe an anonymous tip line abused a little too often. I didn't imagine an actual custody filing. In hindsight, that gap in my imagination is the only reason Deborah nearly got away with what came next. Talia quit driving the kids anywhere without her phone recording. Dashboard mounted. The whole route logged. I told her it felt excessive. She told me excessive was what kept the last family safe long enough to move away in one piece. I stopped arguing. Deborah's tactics shifted from lawn to institution. A letter arrived from the HOA's attorney, a real one, on real letterhead, citing documented pattern of childcare irregularities as grounds for a mandatory board review of my compliance status. HOAs do not conduct childcare reviews. I checked. I responded through my own attorney, a former colleague named Priya Adani, who read the letter and laughed out loud on the phone. An HOA doesn't have jurisdiction over your parenting, she said. This is either incompetence or intimidation. I'm betting intimidation. The board review happened anyway. In a side room after the general meeting, 6 people at a folding table treating me like a defendant. Deborah ran it. My work schedule, whether I'd ever left the children unsupervised for extended periods. I answered every question directly, the way I trained 1,000 witnesses to answer mine. No volunteering, no defensiveness, just facts. 14 minutes. One time, both children safely on my own porch. The room seemed almost disappointed there wasn't more. Deborah wasn't disappointed. She thanked everyone for their time and said the board would continue monitoring the situation. A phrase with no defined endpoint, no criteria for closure, nothing but her own discretion standing between my family and whatever came next. That night, Priya sent me a short text. This isn't really about lawn hoops or trash cans anymore. Document everything. I mean everything. I already was. The folder had grown to 40 pages. It would grow to over 200 before this was finished. Zoe started sleeping badly. She'd wake up asking if Mrs. Kilgore could really take her away for real, like on TV. I told her the truth as gently as I could. Nobody takes children away without a judge's order, and judges don't hand those out for lawn violations. I believed that sentence completely. I had spent 6 years being the judge who signed those orders. I knew exactly how much process, evidence, and cause the law required. I did not yet know how much of that process could be quietly, illegally skipped by someone determined enough. Ron Kilgore caught me alone at the mailboxes and said, low and fast, "She's not going to stop at a review, Marcus. I don't know what she's planning, but I know that look. Watch your kid's schedule." Way before I could ask anything else. That was the first crack in the Kilgore front. A husband, scared enough of his own wife's momentum to warn the man she'd targeted. I didn't understand the depth of it yet. I only understood that a warning like that doesn't come from nothing. I moved Caleb and Zoe's after-school pickup to a fixed 15-minute window, backed up by Talia and, on the days she couldn't make it, by Priya's assistant, a retired paralegal named Dot who treated the assignment like a covert operation and loved every second of it. Deborah noticed the tightened schedule almost immediately. She started appearing at the bus stop herself, just being neighborly, standing close enough to my kids that Zoe began angling her body to keep Caleb behind her, a 10-year-old learning to shield her little brother from a grown woman. I filed a formal complaint with the county about Deborah photographing minors without parental consent. The response was slow, procedural, and useless. A form letter about resolving disputes through community channels. The system built to protect children moved at the speed of a DMV line. Priya suggested I request the HOA's meeting minutes from the past 2 years through the Community Bylaws Public Record Clause. It took 3 requests and a threat of a formal grievance before the board finally, reluctantly, released them. Buried in page 11 was a name I recognized: the Kowalski family. The Kowalskis had left Brookstone 18 months earlier, citing relocation for employment. The minutes showed 6 separate concerns raised by a resident about their household in the 4 months before they moved. No resident was named. Everyone in that meeting room knew who raised concerns. I found a former Kowalski forwarding address through public records and wrote a careful, honest letter, explaining who I was and why I was asking. 2 weeks passed with no answer. I assumed, correctly at the time, that fear had followed them out of the neighborhood. Then, unexpectedly, an email arrived from Angela Kowalski. For sentences. PS on them twice. Both times unfounded. Both times traumatic. And that she'd never had proof solid enough to fight back before they simply gave up and moved to Ohio. She has a friend in the clerk's office, Angela wrote. Things move fast when Deborah wants them to. Get a lawyer before you need one. I already had a lawyer. What I didn't have yet was proof that Deborah's friend was doing anything more than answering emails quickly. That proof arrived sooner than any of us expected. And from the last place I would have predicted, Ron Kilgore's own home office, where he kept, unbeknownst to his wife, backup copies of every HOA financial and administrative record for insurance purposes. Ron called me one evening, voice shaking, and asked to meet at the community park after dark, away from any windows. I brought Priya. He said he'd been sitting on for a long time, hoping I'd never need to hand it over. On it were emails between Deborah and Sherry Voss discussing, in vague but unmistakable language, expediting paperwork for situations requiring urgent attention, alongside a spreadsheet Deborah kept privately, tracking 5 families total, dated back 6 years, each marked with a final status, moved. I was listed on that spreadsheet. Status, pending. Priya went quiet reading it, The particular quiet of a lawyer who's just found the seam in a case that looked unbeatable an hour earlier. "This isn't a neighborhood dispute anymore," she said. "This is a pattern. People." Ron admitted he'd known for years and said nothing, out of fear, exhaustion, and a slowly eroded sense of what was normal. "You get used to it," he said. "You tell yourself it's not that bad. Then then someone with real resources moves in. And you realize how bad it actually was." He'd almost said federal before catching himself. "I noticed. Some instincts you keep sharpened even off the bench." I told Ron I wasn't going to expose him publicly unless it became necessary, and that whatever came next, his cooperation would matter. He nodded, looking, for the first time since I'd met him, like a man setting down something heavy he'd carried much too long. Talia started keeping the kids' backpacks packed with spare clothes, just in case of anything, which felt paranoid until it very much wasn't. I didn't stop her. I still hadn't told anyone in the neighborhood what I actually did for a living. Priya asked, more than once, whether it was time. I said no. Case on assumptions about who I was. I wanted her to keep building it wrong. Deborah, unaware her husband had just handed a federal judge a spreadsheet of her own targeting pattern, escalated anyway, telling the board she had credible information. The Ellison household needed immediate protective attention. No one asked what the information was. No one ever did. That single unchecked sentence, credible information, said with enough confidence, was about to set something in motion that no folder, no thumb drive, and no amount of patience could have fully prepared me for. For almost 2 weeks, nothing happened. Deborah didn't appear at the bus stop. No letters arrived. Skipped its usual passive-aggressive reminder to all residents section. I let myself believe, cautiously, that the pressure had eased. Zoe started sleeping through the night again. Caleb stopped asking about the clipboard lady at bedtime. Talia relaxed the dashboard recording routine to twice a week instead of daily. Even I, trained never to mistake silence for safety, felt something in my shoulders unclench. I hosted a small cookout, half genuine hospitality, half strategy, Priya's idea, to let the neighborhood see you as a person, not a rumor. A dozen families came. Deborah, invited out of pure neighborly obligation, showed up for 11 minutes, complimented the ribs, and left early. She was pleasant the entire 11 minutes. Too pleasant. Across the yard with the same look she'd given me at that first HOA meeting, and later told me quietly, "That's not peace. That's a woman deciding her next move." I chose to enjoy the calm anyway. Renee used to say I treated every quiet moment like a trap waiting to spring, and that sometimes a quiet moment was just a quiet moment. I wanted, badly, for her to be right this time. Ron mentioned, in a brief driveway exchange, that Deborah had been on the phone with Sherry Voss a lot that week. Door closed, voice low. He didn't know what about. I filed it, the way I'd filed everything else, and kept living my life. The kids had a good stretch, a school project finished early, a soccer win, a Saturday at the lake with 2 other families from the block who'd quietly, without ever saying so out loud, decided which side of this they were on. I let Talia take a long weekend to visit her sister, something she hadn't done in months out of loyalty and worry. I handled pickup and drop-off myself, badge-free, tie-free, just a father in jeans standing at a bus stop like every other parent on the street. Deborah stood at her mailbox those mornings, watching, saying nothing. I told myself watching wasn't a crime. I told myself a lot of things that quiet stretch, most of them technically true and completely useless in hindsight. Priya used the lull to quietly file a records request confirming Sherry Voss's exact role and access level at the family court clerk's office. The request would take 3 weeks to process. Neither of us knew we'd need the answer far sooner than that. One evening Caleb asked if Mrs. Kilgore had given up. I told him I didn't know, but that whatever happened, my job was to keep him and his sister safe, and I intended to do that job better than anyone else's. He seemed satisfied. I wasn't. Not really. Patricia stopped by one last time before the calm broke, dropping off tomatoes from her garden, and said something I've replayed since. The families before you got the quiet stretch too. Right before the worst part. Don't unpack anything. Marcus, I laughed it off at the time. Gently, the way you laugh off a friend's overcaution. I wish I'd taken it as the warning it actually was. Precise, specific, and earned from watching this exact pattern play out 3 times already on this street. Because 2 days later, on a Wednesday that started like every other Wednesday, Deborah Kilgore walked into the county family court annex and asked her oldest friend for a favor that would break at least 4 laws before the sun went down. I didn't know it yet. Sitting in chambers reviewing a sentencing memorandum, that 11 miles away Sherry Voss was pulling an emergency ex parte custody request template off a shared drive she wasn't authorized to give anyone outside official court staff. Deborah had filled in the blanks herself. My name, my children's names, a fabricated narrative of repeated unsupervised endangerment, backed by nothing but the 14-minute porch incident, stretched and reshaped until it sounded like a pattern of neglect instead of one late Thursday. Sherry didn't file it through any legitimate court process. There was no judge's signature, no hearing, no case number that would hold up under 30 seconds of scrutiny. What she gave Deborah instead was a document that looked official enough to fool people who didn't know better. Most people on that street didn't know better. Neither did the elementary school's front office. When Deborah walked in that afternoon holding pages with an embossed county seal, claiming to be a designated emergency guardian, authorized to collect Zoe and Caleb Ellison, the front office clerk, a kind but overworked woman named Rosa, had never seen an emergency guardianship document before and had no protocol memorized for verifying one on site. Deborah knew that. It would later come out, specifically chosen a day Rosa was covering the desk alone. Zoe was pulled from 4th period first. Then Caleb from his 2nd grade classroom. Neither child understood what was happening. The last thing Zoe remembers telling the teacher was, "That's not my dad's friend. That's the clipboard lady." Nobody called me, more than almost any other in this entire story. An actual emergency order requires immediate parental notification. Deborah's forged paperwork required nothing, because it wasn't real, and nobody at that school had the training to know the difference in time. I was in a sentencing hearing when Talia's first missed call came through, silenced, sitting face down on the bench beside my notes. By the time I saw it, there were 6 more, and a text that read only, "Marcus, call me the second you see this." Now, I stepped out mid-recess, heart already ahead of my brain, and called her back. She was screaming, half crying, saying the school told her someone had already picked up the kids. Someone with paperwork. Someone the front office had let walk out the door with my children. I don't remember deciding to leave the courthouse. I remember being in my car, hands steady out of pure trained discipline while everything underneath that discipline screamed. I called the school. I called Priya. Yet, know where my children were. The school's principal, once actually reached, confirmed the paperwork had listed Deborah A. Kilgore as emergency guardian, effective immediately, citing documented household safety concerns. I asked what court had issued it. Nobody at the school could tell me. That silence told me everything. Priya was already on the phone with the county courthouse before I'd finished the sentence. She confirmed, within 11 minutes, that no such emergency order existed in any active docket. What Deborah was holding was not a court order. It was a forgery wearing a court order's clothes. I drove straight to Deborah's house. Every instinct I had as a father screamed to break the door down. Every instinct I had as a judge, the one who'd spent years lecturing lawyers about the danger of acting on rage instead of evidence, told me to be smarter than that. I called the police first, from the driveway, and reported a possible unauthorized removal of minors, giving the dispatcher my name, my address, and, for the first time in this entire ordeal, my title. "This is Judge Marcus Ellison," I said. "My children have been taken." Officer Danny Reyes arrived 12 minutes later, and I watched his posture shift the moment he recognized Deborah's name and address from prior, friendlier calls he'd answered on her behalf over the years. He knew her. Expect to find her on the wrong side of anything. Deborah answered her own front door calm, composed, almost pleasant, as though she'd been expecting exactly this visit and had rehearsed for it. "The children are safe," she said, before anyone asked. "I have documentation. This is all being handled properly." Officer Reyes asked to see the documentation. Deborah handed over the forged pages without hesitation. And for one terrible, suspended moment, I watched a man I didn't know yet consider believing her over me, simply because the paper in her hand looked official and I was standing in a driveway. Furious. "Where?" I asked, keeping my voice level through sheer will. "Are my children right now?" Deborah said they were resting comfortably upstairs and that I was clearly too emotionally compromised to be around them at present. Officer Reyes, to his credit, asked to see them himself. Zoe and Caleb were in Deborah's guest room, door not locked but positioned so that a chair blocked easy exit, both of them sitting rigid on the edge of a bed. Caleb crying quietly, Zoe holding him, both of them looking at the doorway like it might bring either rescue or worse. The moment Zoe saw me behind Officer Reyes, she said, loud enough for everyone in the hallway to hear, "Daddy." She said, "You did something bad and we couldn't call you." She took our phones. That single sentence did more legal damage to Deborah than any document I would file for months. Officer Reyes' expression changed completely. Confiscating phones from minors to prevent contact with a non-custodial parent is not handling things properly. It's the textbook definition of unlawful restraint. And even a friendly cop couldn't unhear a 10-year-old say it out loud in front of him. Deborah, sensing the shift, pivoted instantly, her voice climbing half an octave. I was protecting them, she said. Someone had to. The neighborhood was willing to do what's necessary. Necessary, I noted, had become her favorite word for whatever she wanted, whenever she wanted it. I asked Officer Reyes to remove my children from that house immediately. He did, without hesitation this time, and I have never in my life felt anything like the relief of Caleb's arms locking around my neck in that hallway while Zoe gripped my sleeve like she was afraid I'd disappear too. Deborah was not arrested that day. Officer Reyes, still working the edges of an old friendship and a genuinely confusing legal picture, told her only that she needed to stay available for follow-up while the department verified the documentation's legitimacy. She agreed, smiling, entirely too calm for a woman caught mid-crime. I took my children home, checked them for injuries. There were none. Thank God. Only fear. Fed them, and sat between their beds that night without sleeping, replaying the moment I'd have to explain to a 10-year-old why a grown woman with a fake document had almost gotten away with taking her. Priya arrived within the hour, laptop already open, filing an emergency motion of her own, a real one, for a protective order against Deborah Kilgore, supported by the forged document itself, Officer Reyes' incident report, and Zoe's statement about the confiscated phones. By midnight, the county court's actual duty judge had reviewed the emergency filing and confirmed, in writing, that no legitimate order authorizing Deborah Kilgore's custody claim had ever existed. The paper she'd shown the school and the police was fabricated from a template she had no legal right to access. That confirmation put Sherry Voss's fingerprints, figuratively and soon literally, all over a felony. Priya requested the county immediately investigate clerk office access logs. I didn't sleep that night, but for the first time since the school called Talia, I felt something besides fear. I felt the case forming. The next morning, the school district placed Rosa on administrative leave pending review of the front office verification failure. Not as punishment exactly, but as the first domino in a chain reaction Deborah had triggered without understanding how many institutions would have to answer for what she'd bought with one forged document. Talia hadn't slept either. She sat with the kids all morning, and when Zoe asked if Mrs. Kilgore was going to jail now, Talia said only, "That's up to people whose job it is to decide that." She looked at me over Zoe's head. We both knew exactly whose job that was about to become. I hadn't told my children yet what I actually did for a living, not in any detail they'd understood before. That morning, sitting at the kitchen table, I finally did. Zoe's eyes widened. "You're a judge?" she said. "Like, a real judge. Can you make her stop?" I told her the truth. I couldn't be the judge on her case. That wasn't how the law worked. And it shouldn't work that way, even for me. But I told her there were other judges. Real ones. And evidence. And a system that, slowly, was about to start moving in our direction. Word spread through Brookstone Estates fast. Not because I told anyone, but because a police cruiser sitting in Deborah Kilgore's driveway for 40 minutes tends to generate its own gossip. By noon, 3 separate neighbors had texted Patricia asking what on earth had happened. Patricia texted me instead. One line, "Is it what I think it is?" I texted back a single word, "Yes." She replied almost instantly, "Then it's finally going to end. Tell me what you need." I told her I needed anyone who'd witnessed anything to be willing to say so. On record. Within a day, 2 more names came forward quietly. Neighbors who'd seen Deborah photographing my children before, who'd heard her describe me in terms that had nothing to do with lawn maintenance and everything to do with assumptions she'd made the moment she saw my face at that first door knock. Priya built the case methodically, the way good lawyers build cases, not on outrage, but on documents. The forged emergency order, Ron's thumb drive, Zoe's statement, incident report, which, to his credit, he wrote up honestly once the adrenaline cleared. The county's internal investigation into Sherry Voss moved fast once IT confirmed she'd accessed and modified a restricted court template outside her authorized duties.
Twice, on dates matching both my incident and, disturbingly, one from 14 months earlier involving another family entirely, not the Kowalskis. A different one.
That detail stopped me cold. A fourth family. He pull every instance of Sherry Voss accessing that specific document template going back 5 years. The number that came back wasn't 3 families. It was 6. Deborah, still unaware of how much had already been assembled against her, spent that week telling anyone who'd listened that she'd acted in good faith, and that hindsight always looks different. She did not yet know hindsight was about to arrive with a subpoena. Ron came to see me alone one evening, visibly thinner than he'd looked a month earlier. "She doesn't think she did anything wrong," he said. "That's the part that scares me most. She thinks she's owed an apology from you, not the other way around." I believed him completely. I asked Ron, directly, whether he was willing to testify to what he knew, the spreadsheet, the pattern, the years of quiet complicity. He was silent for a long moment, then said, "I should have said something the first time. I'm not staying quiet a second time." That was the turn. Officer Reyes came to see me too, off duty, out of uniform, and admitted he'd known Deborah for almost a decade through community events and had, if he was honest, given her the benefit of the doubt longer than the facts deserved. "Won't happen again," he said. I believed that too. The district attorney's office opened a formal file, kidnapping adjacent charges under the state's unlawful restraint and interference with custody statutes,
Plus fraud charges tied to the forged document. Plus whatever the county decided to pursue against Sherry Voss for abusing restricted court access on at least 6 separate occasions.
Zoe started therapy, gentle and short-term, more precaution than necessity. The school counselor said children are remarkably resilient when the adults around them respond quickly and honestly, and I intended to be exactly that kind of adult for the rest of both my children's childhoods. Caleb asked one more time, at bedtime, if the clipboard lady could ever come back. I told him no, not because I was guessing, but because I now knew, with a judge's certainty, exactly how much legal weight was about to land on Deborah Kilgore's life. Deborah, for her part, hired an attorney of her own, a sharp-suited man from Buckhead who specialized in exactly the kind of damage control her situation now required. His first move was to request a meeting with Priya, to discuss a reasonable resolution before this escalates further. Priya's answer, relayed to me with visible satisfaction, was 4 words: "It already has escalated." She declined the meeting and instead filed a formal notice that criminal referral was already underway with the DA's office, independent of whatever civil resolution Deborah's attorney was hoping to negotiate. The HOA board, sensing exactly which way the wind was blowing, held an emergency session and voted, 8-1, to suspend Deborah Kilgore from her presidency, pending the outcome of ongoing legal matters. The one dissenting vote, unsurprisingly, was Deborah's own, cast for herself. Ron did not attend that meeting. He told me later he couldn't sit in a room and watch his wife's grip on that community finally slip, even though he knew, better than anyone, exactly how much that grip had cost other people over the years. I still hadn't spoken publicly, hadn't confirmed to a single neighbor beyond Priya and Ron and Patricia exactly what my job title was. Deborah. I would learn. Still believed, right up until the moment it stopped mattering, that she'd targeted an ordinary man with no real power to fight back. The forensic accountant Priya hired to review the HOA's finances, at Ron's quiet suggestion, found something neither of us expected. Deborah had been billing the HOA's legal fund for community safety consultations that were, in fact, her own personal meetings with Sherry Voss, dressed up in vague invoice language. Nearly $4,000 in resident dues, over 3 years, had funded Deborah's ability to target families like mine and the Kowalskis. She hadn't just abused informal favors. She'd built a small, self-financed machine for driving people out of a neighborhood she considered hers to curate. When confronted with the invoices by her own board treasurer, a role Ron still technically held, Deborah didn't deny the payments. She called them administrative overhead for maintaining community standards, a phrase so detached from reality that even her own attorney reportedly winced hearing it repeated back to him. The district attorney added embezzlement to the growing list of potential charges. Deborah's attorney requested, again, private resolution. Priya again declined, this time not bothering to relay a soft version of her answer to me. She simply forwarded me the email with one line, not a chance. Sherry Voss, meanwhile, was placed on unpaid leave from the clerk's office pending a full misconduct review, and in what felt like poetic timing, the family she'd helped Deborah target 14 months earlier came forward once the story broke locally. The Alvarez family, driven out after a false neglect claim. Marisol Alvarez called me directly, having found my name through a local news reporter who'd started sniffing around the HOA suspension. I thought it was just us, she said, voice breaking. I thought something was wrong with our family. It was never us. That call did something to me I hadn't expected. I'd spent this entire ordeal focused, necessarily, on protecting Zoe and Caleb. Hearing Marisol's voice reminded me how many other children had grown up believing, wrongly, that their own families were the problem instead of the woman with the clipboard. Deborah's escalation, once it started truly unraveling, didn't slow down, it sped up, the way a cornered person's decisions often do. She began telling neighbors, unprompted, that I was using my position to intimidate a private citizen, a framing that conveniently ignored who had taken whose children first. She was not wrong that my position mattered now. She was wrong about how. I never once used judicial influence to steer the investigation. Priya made sure of that, insisting every step run through ordinary channels. Precisely so nothing about this case could later be challenged as improperly influenced. That restraint mattered more than Deborah understood. The DA's office, the county's clerk misconduct review board, the school district's own internal investigation, all of it moved through standard process, methodically, which meant when the conclusions came, they came clean, unassailable, and entirely hers to answer for. By the time local news picked up the story, HOA president accused of falsifying custody document to seize children. Deborah's name was already attached to 6 documented families, a misused legal fund, and a felony referral. She had built her reputation on control. She was about to lose it publicly, completely, and on the record. The night the local news segment aired, Deborah's attorney called an emergency meeting, and for the first time since this began, heard, secondhand through Priya, that Deborah had used the word unfair to describe her own situation, as though the forged document had filed itself. She gave an interview to a competing outlet the next morning, unprompted by her own lawyer, insisting she'd only ever wanted to protect children, and that certain people were twisting a mother's instinct into something criminal. She did not mention that she had no legal claim to my children whatsoever. That interview backfired instantly. A local advocacy reporter cross-referenced her protecting children claim against the Alvarez case, the Kowalski case, and 2 others, publishing a timeline so damning that even neighbors who'd defended her for a decade began posting, quietly, that they'd always had a bad feeling. Deborah's response to backlash wasn't retreat. It was escalation of a different kind. She began calling former board allies, asking them to publicly vouch for her character, framing herself as a woman being persecuted for caring too much. 2 allies agreed, declined and stopped answering her calls entirely. Ron finally moved out of the house that week, staying with his brother across town, telling me only, "I can't watch her do this to herself anymore. Or to you, us kids." It was the most honest sentence I'd heard him say since the whole ordeal began. Deborah, alone in that house now, reportedly began driving past my property at odd hours, not stopping, not confronting, just slow, deliberate passes that Patricia and 2 other neighbors documented independently, dashcams and doorbell cameras stitching together a pattern that looked less like grief and more like obsession. Priya used that pattern to file for an emergency temporary restraining order, and it was granted within a day, barring Deborah from coming within 500 feet of my property, my children's school, or any location my children were known to regularly attend. Deborah violated it once. For days later, she claimed, when the responding officer arrived, that she'd simply forgotten the boundary while driving to her usual grocery store, a route that, notably, had never once passed my street before this entire situation began. The violation added a contempt charge to her already lengthening file. Zoe asked me, around this time, whether Mrs. Kilgore hated us because of something we'd done. I told her the truth, as plainly as a 10-year-old could hold it. Some people decide who you are before they ever really look at you, and no amount of goodness changes their mind. It's never about you. I meant that for Zoe, but I meant it for myself too. I'd spent a career on the bench believing the law, applied carefully enough, protects people regardless of what someone else assumes about them at first glance. This case was testing that belief in ways no docket ever had. Deborah's attorney formally withdrew from her case that week, citing irreconcilable differences regarding strategy, legal language for a lawyer who no longer wanted his name attached to a client escalating in full public view. She hired a second attorney within 48 hours, younger, cheaper, visibly out of his depth. The DA's office, now working with a fully substantiated pattern across 6 families, a misused legal fund, a forged court document, phone confiscation from a minor, and a restraining order violation, moved to formally indict Deborah on multiple felony counts. The grand jury proceeding was scheduled within the month. Deborah, cornered legally, made her most extreme move yet. She contacted a local talk radio host, a man known for provocative segments, and gave an hour-long interview accusing me, by name, of abusing federal authority to destroy a private citizen's life over a misunderstanding about children playing outside. That interview finally, publicly, connected my name to my job title in a way I hadn't chosen or wanted. Within hours, local reporters confirmed I was, in fact, a sitting federal district judge, and the story shifted overnight from a neighborhood dispute into statewide news. The headlines weren't kind to Deborah. HOA president forged custody document to seize federal judge's children, ran across 3 outlets by that evening. She had spent months assuming my quiet, low-profile life meant powerlessness. She had never once considered that quiet and powerless are not the same thing. I gave exactly one statement to the press, brief and lawyerly, that the matter was proceeding through the appropriate legal channels, that my children were safe, and that I had every confidence the justice system, the real one, not a forged imitation of it, would handle the rest. Deborah's second attorney quit within a week of the story going statewide, reportedly telling colleagues privately that his client would not stop talking to reporters no matter how many times I told her to stop, a level of self-sabotage that even seasoned defense lawyers found remarkable. Sherry Voss, facing her own mounting exposure, did what cornered co-conspirators often do. She began cooperating with investigators, providing a full account of every document she'd falsified for Deborah over the years, in exchange for a recommendation of leniency in her own upcoming charges. Sherry's cooperation confirmed everything the thumb drive had suggested and more. Deborah had specifically asked for the emergency guardianship template by name, knew precisely how illegitimate it was, and had told Sherry, in a recorded voicemail Sherry had kept for her own protection, that she didn't care if it was technically legal, just that it would work fast. That voicemail, played for a grand jury weeks later, ended any lingering question about intent. Deborah hadn't misunderstood a gray area of the law. She had knowingly, deliberately, chosen fraud because she believed correctly, for 6 families running, that nobody would ever check the paperwork closely enough to stop her. She was almost right a 7th time. The only reason she wasn't, Priya told me once, quiet and direct, over coffee one evening, was that this particular family happened to include a father who knew exactly what real legal process looked like, and refused to be talked out of demanding it. Patricia organized an informal gathering of the affected families, the Kowalskis by video call from Ohio, the Alvarez family in person, 2 others still living nearby, not for revenge, she said, but so nobody had to carry the specific, isolating shame Deborah had engineered into each of their lives alone anymore. Marisol Alvarez cried through most of that call. So did Angela Kowalski. I didn't, not in front of everyone, but that night, once the kids were asleep, I sat alone in the kitchen and finally let myself feel the full weight of everything I'd been holding steady for weeks. Deborah, facing indictment, facing statewide coverage, facing the collapse of a decade-long reputation built entirely on controlling other people's lives, did the one thing I genuinely hadn't anticipated. She requested, through her 3rd attorney, a meeting not to negotiate, but to speak with me directly, alone, one last time. Priya advised strongly against it. I agreed to a supervised version instead. Her office, both attorneys present, recorded. I wanted, honestly, to understand what version of events Deborah had built in her own head that let her believe, even now, that she was somehow the wronged party in all of this. Deborah arrived composed, controlled, still carrying herself like a woman used to being obeyed. She said she was sorry if things had gone further than intended. Language so carefully hedged it barely qualified as an apology at all, and asked whether I'd be willing to speak on her behalf at sentencing. I told her no. Calmly, the same way I'd once explained sentences to defendants who still didn't fully grasp what they'd done. That 6 families had rearranged their lives around her belief that she was entitled to decide who belonged in that neighborhood. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was a decade of choices. Priya spent the following weeks preparing the civil case parallel to the criminal one, a wrongful restraint and fraud suit that would name not just Deborah but,
through discovery, potentially the HOA's insurer, given how long the board had known, or should have known, about the pattern of complaints.
The school district's internal review concluded that Rosa should not have released the children without direct verbal parental confirmation, regardless of documentation, and instituted a new mandatory callback policy for any emergency guardianship claim, a change that would, going forward, protect every family after mine from this exact vulnerability. Officer Reyes testified at the department's own internal review, admitting candidly that his prior familiarity with Deborah had delayed his skepticism of her. Paperwork longer than it should have. An admission that cost him a formal reprimand but earned him, from me at least, a measure of respect for saying it plainly. Ron agreed to testify for the prosecution, and in preparation sessions with the DA's office, revealed one final detail he'd been holding back. Deborah had specifically chosen targets who wouldn't have the resources to fight back, a criterion she'd stated to him directly, more than once. Over the years, that single admitted criterion reframed the entire case for the grand jury. This wasn't a woman overzealous about neighborhood safety. This was a calculated pattern of selecting families she believed were powerless, precisely because their powerlessness made her scheme sustainable, until the one time her calculation was simply wrong. I sat with that reframing for a long time. I hadn't been targeted because of anything I'd done. I'd been targeted, initially, because Deborah assumed a black father raising 2 kids alone, with a nanny instead of a wife, fit a story she'd already decided to believe before we'd exchanged 10 words. Priya asked whether I wanted that racial dimension formally raised in the criminal proceedings. I told her yes, not for theater, but because the pattern across all 6 families showed it plainly. Every single household Deborah had targeted was a family she'd viewed, from the very first interaction, as somehow less entitled to belong. The grand jury heard testimony spanning 3 full days. Ron, Officer Reyes, the forensic accountant, a records custodian confirming Sherry's unauthorized access, and finally Zoe's recorded forensic interview, gentle and carefully conducted, describing in a 10-year-old's plain language exactly what happened at Deborah's house that afternoon. Deborah did not testify before the grand jury. On her attorney's advice, though she continued, against that same advice, giving brief statements to any reporter who'd still return her calls, insisting the entire process was a coordinated attack, rather than the direct consequence of choices she'd made herself. Repeatedly, For years, the indictment came back on all major counts: fraud, unlawful restraint of a minor, embezzlement of HOA funds, and pending further review potential charges tied to the 5 earlier families. Should any choose to formally press forward now that the pattern was public record and legally substantiated, Marisol Alvarez chose to press forward. So did the Kowalskis, from Ohio, filing a joint civil action alongside mine. The other 2 earlier families remained private but supportive, having moved on with their lives in ways Priya said the law needed to respect, even while the criminal case moved without them. Deborah's bail hearing drew a small crowd of reporters and, notably, almost no neighbors from Brookstone Estates willing to stand publicly beside her. The HOA board formally revoked her membership entirely, not just her presidency, citing violation of community conduct standards she herself had originally written into the bylaws years earlier. I found a strange, quiet justice in that particular detail, that the very rules Deborah had used for a decade to police other families' lives were the rules that finally, formally, expelled her from the community she'd spent so long believing she owned outright. Ron filed for divorce the same week the indictment came down, telling me only that he needed, for the first time in 22 years of marriage, to build a life that wasn't organized around managing his wife's need for control over everyone within reach of her. Zoe, watching all of this unfold from the safe distance childhood mercifully provides, asked me one evening whether it was over yet. I told her almost that the last part, the part where a judge decided what happened to Mrs. Kilgore, was still coming, but that we were, finally, on the winning side of it. Priya and the DA's office spent the following weeks assembling the full trial package. Every document, every witness, every forensic interview into a case so layered that Deborah's 4th attorney, a public defender assigned after she exhausted her private funds paying off the first 3, requested an immediate plea discussion. Deborah refused to consider a plea. Her public defender told Priya, off the record, that his client remained convinced a jury would ultimately see her as a well-intentioned woman caught in an overzealous system, a belief Priya described afterward as the last real sign of how little self-awareness this entire case revealed. I spent those weeks preparing my own testimony with a victim's advocate rather than a legal strategist, learning to speak not as a judge who understood the process intellectually, but as a father who needed a jury to understand, viscerally, what it felt like to not know where his children were for 2 hours. Talia agreed to testify about the 14-minute gap that started everything, determined that the record show plainly how thin the original concern had actually been a single, brief, ordinary lapse no different from 1,000 other families' ordinary Thursdays, weaponized into the justification for everything that followed. The forensic accountant finalized her report, $3,860 in misappropriated HOA funds, funneled specifically toward maintaining Deborah's relationship with Sherry Voss and, disturbingly, toward a private investigator hired briefly to research my employment before Deborah ever learned the specific truth of what I actually did. That detail chilled me more than almost anything else in the case. Deborah had suspected, on some level, that I might not be the powerless target she needed, and instead of backing away, she'd paid someone to dig deeper, hoping to confirm I was harmless before committing fully to her scheme. The investigator's own report, subpoenaed by Priya, came back inconclusive on my job title but noted, in a chillingly clinical line, that the subject appears to work long, Irregular hours consistent with either a demanding corporate role or shift-based employment. A guess Deborah apparently decided to gamble against. She gambled wrong. And by the time the trial date arrived, that gamble had cost her a decade of reputation, her marriage, her HOA presidency, her legal fund access, and, should the jury side with the mountain of evidence against her, potentially years of her actual freedom. Jury selection took 2 full days. Both sides carefully screening for anyone with strong prior opinions about HOAs, about custody disputes, or, delicately, about the racial dynamics Priya intended to raise plainly rather than dance around, given how directly they'd shaped Deborah's original targeting pattern. The morning of opening statements, Deborah arrived at the courthouse in a modest navy suit, hair different, posture smaller than the woman who'd once stood on my lawn filming my children like evidence. Whatever calculation she was running now, it clearly involved looking as unlike her old self as possible. The prosecution's opening statement was simple and devastating. A woman with no legal authority over 6 separate families had used forged documents, misappropriated funds, and a friend's compromised position at the county clerk's office to seize children and terrorize households for over half a decade, undetected, until one father refused to stop asking questions. Deborah's public defender's opening leaned entirely on intent, arguing his client genuinely believed she was protecting vulnerable children and that overzealous concern, however misguided, is not the same crime as malicious fraud. Priya, watching from the gallery beside me, whispered, "That's a losing argument and he knows it." Zoe's forensic interview video played for the jury on day 2. Watching it again, watching my daughter's small, steady voice describe having her phone taken so she couldn't call me, was harder than anything I'd sat through in my own courtroom in 6 years on the bench. 2 jurors were visibly moved. One, an older woman in the back row, glanced at Deborah with an expression I recognized instantly from my own courtroom, the specific look a juror gets the moment they've quietly, privately, already decided the verdict, long before deliberations formally begin. Ron's testimony landed with particular weight, a husband describing, plainly and without excuse-making, how he'd watched his wife target family after family for years, staying silent out of fear and habit until a thumb drive he'd kept, just in case, finally became the case's turning point. Sherry Voss testified under her cooperation agreement, walking the jury through exactly how she'd pulled the restricted template, exactly what Deborah had said on the recorded voicemail, and exactly how many times, 6, precisely, she'd done this before, each time believing, wrongly, that no family would ever push back hard enough. The prosecutor played that voicemail for the jury in full, Deborah's own voice, brisk and untroubled, saying she didn't care if it was technically legal, just that it would work fast. The courtroom went completely silent afterward, the particular silence of a room that has just heard someone convict themselves. Deborah's public defender attempted, weakly, to argue the voicemail had been taken out of context. The prosecutor's cross-examination of Sherry Voss closed that door entirely, confirming there was no context in which, "I don't care if it's legal" meant anything other than exactly what it said. Marisol Alvarez testified next, describing the 18 months her family spent believing something was wrong with them, believing they'd somehow failed as parents, only to learn, after this trial finally exposed the pattern, that they'd been one of 6 households targeted by a woman with no legal standing whatsoever. I watched the jury during Marisol's testimony. Several of them were crying by the end. Deborah sat perfectly still, hands folded, the same composed posture she'd worn since arriving that first morning, as though composure alone could substitute for the accountability everyone else in that room clearly expected from her. My own testimony came on day 4. I described the 14 minutes, the school's call, the drive to Deborah's house not knowing what I'd find, and the moment Zoe said, from the doorway of that guest room, that Deborah had taken her phone so she couldn't call me. The prosecutor asked me directly what that moment felt like. I said, honestly, that in 6 years on the federal bench, sentencing people who'd done genuinely terrible things, I had never once felt the specific, complete terror of not knowing where my own children were for 2 full hours. Deborah's attorney's cross-examination of me was brief and, frankly, unwise. He attempted to suggest my judicial position had somehow intimidated his client into overreacting, a framing that ignored the 6 families targeted long before Deborah ever knew what I did for a living. I answered plainly that Deborah had begun targeting my family the same week we moved in, weeks before she asked what I did for work, and months before she learned the answer. My job title hadn't caused this. It had simply meant I had the resources to finally stop it. That answer landed exactly as Priya had hoped it would. Quiet, factual, and impossible to spin. The defense had no follow-up question that didn't risk making things worse. And Deborah's attorney sat down after barely 90 seconds, visibly aware he'd gained nothing from the exchange. Closing arguments began the following morning. The prosecutor walked the jury through 6 families. 1 forged document, a misused legal fund, a confiscated child's phone, and a voicemail that removed any question of intent, asking the jury to hold Deborah accountable not for one mistake, but for a sustained, deliberate pattern. Deborah's public defender, in his closing, finally shifted strategy entirely, asking the jury for leniency rather than acquittal, describing his client as a woman whose need for control spiraled beyond her ability to see the harm she was causing, an argument that at least, unlike his opening, acknowledged reality. Deborah reportedly told him, afterward, that she didn't authorize that framing and still believed a full acquittal was possible. Priya, hearing this secondhand from a courthouse contact, said only, "That's the most honest thing I've learned about her this entire case. She still doesn't think she did anything wrong." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. I spent those hours at home with Zoe and Caleb, trying, and mostly failing, to focus on anything besides my phone. Talia made dinner nobody really ate. Priya called every 90 minutes with the same update. Nothing yet. Still deliberating. That's not a bad sign. At 6:47 that evening, the call came. Verdict reached. Old steadiness I recognized from years of watching lawyers brace themselves for either outcome. "We need to go now," she said. I told Talia to stay with the kids. This part, at least, was mine to finish alone. The courtroom was fuller than it had been all trial. Reporters, neighbors, the Alvarez and Kowalski families watching remotely on a video link Priya had arranged specifically so they wouldn't have to sit in the same room as Deborah again after everything she'd already put them through. Deborah stood when the jury foreperson rose, still composed, still holding herself like a woman who believed, right up until the actual words were spoken aloud. That this room would somehow rule in her favor the way every HOA meeting room had ruled in her favor for 11 straight years. The foreperson read the verdict on the fraud charge first. Guilty. Then unlawful restraint of a minor. Guilty. Then embezzlement. Guilty. Deborah's composure finally, visibly, cracked on the third count. Her hand gripping the defense table like the floor beneath her had genuinely started to move. The courtroom didn't erupt. Exactly. But a low sound moved through the gallery, the specific, restrained relief of people who'd waited a very long time to hear consequences spoken out loud in a room with actual legal authority to enforce them. Deborah turned to look at me for the first time since testimony began. And for one brief moment, I saw something underneath the composure. Not remorse exactly, but the dawning, furious realization that the man she'd spent a decade assuming was powerless had just proven, decisively, that he never had been. Her attorney requested a moment with his client. Deborah didn't take it. Still upright, still rigid, and said loudly enough for the gallery to hear, "This isn't over." A sentence that would have sounded threatening from almost anyone else and instead just sounded, finally, small. The judge presiding, a colleague of mine from the state bench, careful throughout the trial to avoid even the appearance of favoritism given who I was, set sentencing for 6 weeks out, pending a full pre-sentence investigation covering all 6 identified families. Not just mine. Ron, sitting 2 rows behind me, didn't approach Deborah as she was led toward processing. He told me afterward it was the strangest feeling of his adult life. Watching 22 years of marriage end in a room full of strangers, and feeling, more than grief, something close to relief. Sherry Voss's own sentencing hearing was scheduled separately, her cooperation likely to earn her a reduced sentence, though the county clerk's office had already terminated her employment and referred the matter to the State Bar's Records Integrity Oversight Board for good measure. Rosa, the school clerk, was reinstated after the district's review concluded she'd been failed by inadequate verification protocols rather than personal negligence, a distinction Priya insisted on publicly, unwilling to let an overworked employee absorb blame that belonged entirely to Deborah's forged paperwork. The HOA board, in the wake of the verdict, voted unanimously to dissolve the community concerns reporting system Deborah had built and weaponized for years, replacing it with a formal, documented process requiring actual evidence and board majority approval before any resident's family could be formally reviewed. Marisol Alvarez called me that night, voice lighter than I'd heard it since our first conversation. "We're going to be okay," she said. And I understood she didn't just mean the pending civil settlement. She meant something closer to the shame finally, completely, lifting off her family for good. Angela Kowalski sent a single text from Ohio, a photo of her kids laughing in their backyard. No caption needed. I understood exactly what she meant by sending it. Some victories don't need explaining. They just need to be seen by someone who understands what they cost to get there. Zoe asked me that evening whether Mrs. Kilgore was in trouble now. For real. I told her yes. For real. And that sometimes it takes a long time for real trouble to catch up to people who've spent years believing they were untouchable. It caught up to Deborah exactly when it needed to. Caleb, more practically minded at 7 than his sister at 10, asked if this meant we could put the basketball hoop back up without getting a notice about it. I told him yes. Absolutely. First thing that weekend. Some victories are enormous. Some are just a hoop back on a driveway. The pre-sentence investigation, conducted over the following weeks, formally documented all 6 targeted families, the misused HOA funds, the forged emergency order, and Sherry Voss's cooperating testimony, compiling a report so thorough that even Deborah's public defender reportedly told colleagues he had nothing left to argue with. Deborah, out on bail pending sentencing, made one final attempt at reputation management, a lengthy social media post insisting she'd been made an example of, and that nobody in that community will ever feel as safe as they did under my leadership. The post was widely mocked. Patricia forwarded me a screenshot with a single line of commentary. She really believes this, Marcus. Even now, I believed Patricia completely. That was, in the end, the most unsettling part of the entire ordeal. Not that Deborah had done what she did, but that she never once seemed to understand why it was wrong. I spent those weeks focused entirely on my children, taking 2 of my 6 weeks of accrued leave, driving them to school myself every single morning, staying visible, present, and boring in exactly the way I'd wanted to be from the very first day we moved into Brookstone Estates. Zoe's nightmares faded first. Caleb's followed a few weeks later, helped along by a new basketball hoop, reinstalled the Saturday after the verdict, with half the block showing up unprompted to watch. A small, unplanned gathering that felt, more than anything, like the neighborhood finally exhaling. Ron stopped by that Saturday too, briefly, standing at the edge of the driveway the way he always had, and said only, "I'm glad it's over for you and the kids." Truly, I told him I was glad he'd finally found the nerve to hand over that thumb drive. He nodded and left. Sentencing day arrived on a gray, unremarkable Tuesday. Nothing like the dramatic courtroom scenes from the trial itself. Just a quiet room, a presiding judge, a stack of victim impact statements, and Deborah Kilgore, seated where defendants sit, finally out of arguments and out of time. Marisol Alvarez read her impact statement first, describing 18 months of unwarranted shame that had nearly ended her marriage under the strain of believing, falsely, that something was wrong with her parenting rather than with the woman next door pulling strings behind their backs. Angela Kowalski's statement, read aloud by her attorney since she'd chosen not to fly in, described the specific cruelty of being driven from a home she'd loved by someone who never once had to explain herself to anyone. Until this exact moment, in this exact room, I read my own statement last, describing not the 14 minutes on the porch, not even the 2 hours my children spent behind Deborah's door, but the smaller, quieter damage, Zoe's nightmares, Caleb's fear of basketball hoops, the year my children lost simply believing our home wasn't safe anymore. Deborah was given the opportunity to speak before sentencing. She stood, and for a long moment said nothing, the silence stretching until even her own attorney glanced sideways, waiting. Then she said, simply, "I only ever wanted to keep this neighborhood the way it was supposed to be." The judge, unmoved, noted for the record that the way it was supposed to be, in Deborah's telling, had apparently required forging court documents, embezzling community funds, and confiscating a 10-year-old's phone to prevent her from calling her own father, a standard the law had no interest in accommodating. Sentencing came down firmly. 4 years for the combined fraud and unlawful restraint charges. 18 months for embezzlement, to run partially concurrent, alongside a permanent injunction barring Deborah from any HOA leadership role in the state and mandatory restitution to all 6 affected families. Deborah did not react visibly to the number, though her hands, gripping the defense table again, told a different story than her face did. Her attorney requested a brief recess before processing. The judge granted it. It was, in every practical sense, the last real decision Deborah would make as a free woman for years. I didn't feel triumphant watching her led out of that courtroom. I felt, mostly, tired, the specific exhaustion of a fight finally ending, replaced slowly, over the following days, by something quieter and more durable, the simple relief of my children sleeping through entire nights again. Sherry Voss received a lighter sentence in exchange for her cooperation. Probation, a permanent bar from any court-adjacent employment, and mandatory restitution of her own, a consequence that felt, to everyone involved, proportionate to a woman who'd enabled harm rather than orchestrated it from the start. The civil suits settled within 2 months. Structured payments to all 6 families, funded in part by Deborah's remaining assets and, uncomfortably but appropriately, by the HOA's insurance policy. Given the board's own documented failure to act on years of prior complaints about her conduct, Ron finalized his divorce quietly, sold the house, and moved into a small condo across town, telling me in our last real conversation that he intended to spend the coming years, quote, being the kind of neighbor I should have been the first time someone warned me something was wrong. The school district's new emergency guardianship verification protocol, adopted directly in response to what happened to my children, was later adopted by 2 neighboring counties after local news coverage highlighted exactly how close a single forged document had come to succeeding through an ordinary front office on an ordinary Wednesday. Marisol Alvarez started a small support network for families who'd experienced HOA-related harassment, connecting quietly with the Kowalskis and, eventually, 3 more families statewide who'd recognized pieces of their own stories in the extensive local coverage of Deborah's trial and conviction. I declined every interview request that came in after sentencing, save one, a brief statement, released through the courthouse press office, thanking the investigators, the DA's office, and, specifically, Ron Kilgore, whose decision to finally speak up had made every other piece of this case possible. Zoe asked, months later, whether it was strange that Mr. Kilgore had ended up being one of the people who helped us most. I told her that was one of the more important lessons in all of this, that people who stay quiet too long can still choose, eventually, to do the right thing. Caleb, for his part, mostly just wanted to know if we could get a dog now that things had calmed down. We got a dog. Cheerful mutt named Gavel. A joke only Priya fully appreciated, who slept at the foot of Caleb's bed every single night from that point forward. Brookstone Estates elected a new HOA board within the month, Patricia among them, running specifically on a platform of transparency and accountability, a phrase that would have sounded hollow a year earlier and now landed, for every resident who'd lived through Deborah's decade of quiet control, like an actual promise. The new board's first act was formally rescinding every disputed fine and complaint filed against my family, the Alvarez family, the Kowalskis, and the 2 other households from Deborah's spreadsheet, wiping clean a decade of documented harassment disguised, for years, as ordinary community governance. Patricia called it returning the paperwork to what it should have always been about, actual rules, applied fairly to everyone, without a clipboard used as a weapon. I told her that was, honestly, a better summary of the entire ordeal than anything I could have written myself. Judge or not, I finally, formally, told the neighborhood what I did for a living, not out of any need for recognition, but because Priya pointed out, gently, that hiding it any longer served no purpose now that the case was resolved and the truth had already reached every local paper anyway. Neighbors reacted mostly with quiet surprise, a few with sheepish embarrassment at how differently they might have treated me a year earlier had they known, and one, an older man named Walt from 3 houses down, simply said, "Good. Glad it was someone who could actually do something about her." Talia stayed on with us, promoted quietly in her own way to something closer to family than employee, present for Gavel's first muddy paw prints across the kitchen floor and for the first entirely ordinary, uneventful bus stop morning in nearly a year. Officer Reyes stopped by once, off duty, to apologize directly to Zoe for not believing her sooner that day in Deborah's hallway. Zoe, 10 years old and endlessly more forgiving than the situation strictly required, told him it was okay, as long as he believed kids faster next time. He promised he would. 6 months after sentencing, I received a letter from the county corrections facility, forwarded through Priya's office. It was from Deborah. Still careful, still controlled, insisting she'd reflected deeply, and hoped I could someday understand her intentions had never been malicious. I did not respond. Priya asked if I wanted to. I told her no, not out of anger, but because some conversations only matter if the other person has actually changed. And nothing in that letter suggested Deborah had moved an inch past believing she'd simply been unlucky enough to target the wrong family. Ron sent one letter too, months later, entirely different in tone, an apology, unprompted, for the years he'd stayed silent while watching his wife harm family after family, and a brief update that he'd started volunteering with a local mediation nonprofit, trying, in his words, to be useful to people now instead of just quiet. I wrote him back, responding to Deborah never would have. Some people spend a crisis discovering exactly who they are. Ron spent his discovering, slowly and honestly, who he should have been all along, and then actually became that person once the crisis ended. The Alvarez and Kowalski families both settled comfortably into new communities, the Kowalskis eventually reaching out to say they'd finally, after 18 months of feeling unsettled, started to feel at home somewhere again. A small, ordinary sentence that meant, to anyone who understood their history, everything. Brookstone Estates, under Patricia's board, became, improbably, one of the more genuinely pleasant places to live in the county. Not because conflict disappeared entirely. Neighborhoods never fully avoid that. But because disagreements finally got resolved through actual process instead of one woman's private notebook and a compromised friend at the courthouse. Zoe, a year later, wrote a short essay for a school assignment about a time you were brave. She wrote about sitting in that guest room holding Caleb's hand, telling him it would be okay even though she wasn't sure it would be. Her teacher called it the best essay in the class. Caleb, asked the same question at a younger grade level, wrote 3 sentences about Gavel learning to sit. I told him both essays were exactly right for exactly who wrote them, And that bravery, the 7, sometimes just looks like getting through an ordinary day with your family intact. I went back to the bench that same year with a case docket that felt, oddly, lighter to carry, not because the work had changed, but because I now understood. In a way, 6 years on the bench alone had never quite taught me precisely what real, undeserved fear costs an ordinary family. I started, quietly, mentoring a legal aid clinic that handled exactly the kind of cases my own family had nearly fallen through the cracks of families. Without a judge's resources, without Priya's expertise, targeted by people who understood, correctly, that most victims simply can't afford to fight back. Marisol Alvarez joined that clinic's advisory board within the year, determined that no other family should have to wait, as hers had, for a stranger's specific circumstances to finally expose a pattern that should have been stopped the very first time it happened. Deborah remains, as of this writing, still serving her sentence, still insisting, according to Ron's occasional updates, that she was simply a woman who cared too much, punished for caring. Nobody who lived through what her caring actually cost 6 separate families believes that sentence anymore. Not even, I suspect, her. I think often about the 14 minutes that started all of this, an ordinary lapse. The kind every working parent experiences eventually, weaponized by someone who'd already decided, long before that Thursday, exactly which families deserved grace and which didn't. I think, too, about how close it came to working. A forged document. A friendly officer's old loyalty. 6 families before mine who never had the resources to push back hard enough to stop her. The system nearly failed all of us the same quiet way. Every single time. What finally stopped it wasn't my title, though that helped once the fight was already underway. It was Talia's folder. Patricia's warnings. Zoe's brave, plain sentence in a hallway. Ordinary people, refusing, each in their own way, to stay quiet once it mattered enough to speak. Zoe still waves at the bus stop every morning, the same way she always did, except now Patricia waves back, and Walt waves back, and the whole street, finally, feels like the kind of place my kids deserve to grow up in from the very first day we moved there. Caleb still has his basketball hoop. Gavel still sleeps at the foot of his bed. Talia still drives the carpool route. Phone no longer recording out of fear, just playing music the kids pick. Loud and cheerful. On ordinary Tuesday afternoons that finally feel, again, completely ordinary. I never wanted to be the story anyone told about their neighborhood. I only ever wanted to raise my children in peace. The same as every parent Deborah ever targeted before me. In the end, the law did what it was built to do. Once someone finally had the standing to make it listen. Some nights I still check on Zoe and Caleb before I go to sleep. Longer than I probably need to, just to watch them breathing. Safe. Home. Exactly where they belong. Some fears don't fully leave. They just get quieter. Once you know, for certain, that the people meant to protect your family finally did. Brookstone Estates elected its 3rd post-Deborah board this spring. Transparent, ordinary, unremarkable in exactly the way a neighborhood should be. My children are safe. My family is whole. Behind a very different set of walls. A woman who once believed she owned an entire community finally understands what it costs to lose one.